Hello and welcome back to Nocturnity, my friends. Tonight we have an intense story for you that ends with a scene of terror that will be sure to have you digging out that old nightlight for security after you hear it. It's a detailed account of one man's living hell that will take enough time to warrant it as the sole story in this episode, which has once again been brought to you by cardanapparel.com, link in the description. So, as it is an epic tale, let's waste no more time and dive headlong now into the thick of it and escape once again into the realm of eternal night. Insomnia will drive you crazy. I know this from experience. I've suffered with it. It only lasted a week, but it was by far the wildest week of my life. When you haven't slept for days on end, your whole world begins to fall apart. All of your senses become conflicted. Even breathing becomes a chore. You're tired all day, but by nighttime, you're back to being wired, and your mind tortures you all night long. This isn't to mention the damage you can do to your organs by not giving them rest. It's devastating. Sleep is just as important as eating, and we all know what happens when you don't eat. Most people develop this illness through stresses in their lives. I guess I can say the same in my case. The only difference is, the stress I was encountering was of a different kind than most. It all started when I moved into a 3-story house in Savannah. That's Georgia, in case you're not from around here. My brother Cliff and I had lived in different states for a number of years, he in Nebraska and me in California, but by chance both landed jobs in Georgia at the same time. It's not that miraculous, I suppose. We were born and raised in Georgia, so we had numerous contacts out there, but still a seemingly great coincidence. This turn of events made no one happier than our parents, who were divorced when we were in our teens, but both still lived in houses on Skidaway Island. Both me and Cliff were single at the time, so we decided rather than getting a small place each, we'd put our money together and rent as big of a house as we could get. We found a 4-bedroom palace of a house in no time. We had our father go out and take a look at it for us, since we were both out of state at the time, and he described it as a 19th century dream home. For the price, he told us, we'd be fools to pass it up, and even jokingly threatened to take it for himself if we were stupid enough not to. Obviously, we took his word for it and sent over the deposit immediately. 14 days later, we were officially moving in. It felt so great to be back in Georgia, let me tell you. It was springtime, so the dogwoods and azaleas were in full bloom almost everywhere you looked. The temperature was perfect, both day and night, and it felt like I was home again after being away for a lifetime. Cliff and I hosted our old friends for supper and drinks that night after they'd helped us unload the moving trucks all day. It was a textbook Savannah feast: fried chicken, crab stew, shrimp skewers, baked oysters, red rice, grits, smoked collard greens, and plenty of ice-cold ground pounder pale ales. There wasn't a crumb left by the end. We were all ready to bust. Needless to say that the first night I slept like a baby who was longing for his crib. I woke up the next morning with a huge smile on my face as I got ready for work with the rising sun dancing in through the drapes. That night, though, well, that was a completely different story. The evening itself was great. We had no company, so even though my brother and I had spoken on the phone regularly over the past few years, some actual FaceTime gave us a great opportunity to really catch up and reminisce about old times. And finally, it was time for us to seek out our beds. Now, since it was such a big house, we chose rooms as far away from each other as possible, giving us ample privacy. I mean, let's face it, we were 2 grown men now. We'd passed by our bunk bed days decades ago. I was in a basement in a room bigger than the master upstairs on the 3rd floor, which itself was huge and which my brother occupied. I showered, brushed my teeth, threw on an undershirt and briefs, and got under my covers, still basking in the happiness of being back home again. However, just as I was crossing the threshold into full-on sleep, my attention was grabbed by talking. Well, whispering to be precise. It was almost inaudible, like so quiet I had to question whether I was really hearing it or not. I laid perfectly still and listened in, and decided, yes, I could definitely hear something. I supposed my brother was probably watching TV upstairs and I could faintly hear it through the vents, and I did my best to brush it off and ignore it. I mean, I'd lived without a roommate for a while and was going to have to get accustomed to having one again. That means gaining back the ability to fall asleep while noise is going on elsewhere in the house. When I was a kid, the sound of a TV downstairs actually used to calm me at night. With any luck, I thought, that'll be the case once again. Unfortunately, it wasn't at the moment. It's like the more I tried to tune it out, the more noticeable the whispering got. After about an hour or so, I finally decided I had to say something. By then, I was confused as to why my brother was still watching TV anyways. He had to get up earlier than me. He must have fallen asleep with it on, I thought. So I pulled the covers off myself, got up, and walked over to the staircase, but oddly, when I began to walk up them, it became patently clear that there was no TV on anywhere in the house. By the time I was on the main floor, this was a definite. I could see the top of the stairs to my brother's room. His bedroom door was open, and it was pitch black dark in there. In fact, I could hear his snores. This didn't make any sense. I thought I'd sneak up and double check. Creeping up the stairs, I peeked into his room, and he was out. More importantly, his television was off. As confusing as this was for me, it was also a relief. I figured he must have turned it off before I got to the stairs in the basement and headed back down there thinking I'd be able to get some sleep now. Nope. I was wrong. After my head hit the pillow and I closed my eyes, the whispering found its way back into both of my ears. I opened my eyes and looked around perturbed. What the hell is that, I wondered. It definitely sounded like a person whispering. What was being said, I couldn't tell you. I could only really hear the letters, characteristics of whispers, like S's and SH's and CH's and C's and K's and X's and so forth. What's more, there were no breaks in the sentences. It was constant speech, as if whoever was saying whatever it was they were saying took no breaths the whole time. I listened intently, at first trying to make out what was being said, which was hopeless. I then became transfixed on trying to hear where it was coming from. It was as if it was coming from all directions. Eventually, I was standing up and walking around in the dark to every corner of the room trying to pinpoint its place of origin. But the volume was the same everywhere I went. Again, it was almost silent. Simply moving your hand along your clothes was enough to overpower it. It's as if it only existed in the silence, yet broke it all the same. It was driving me crazy. Laying back in bed, I did my best to ignore it again. But again, that was a lost cause. This was unignorable. It was non-stop. Finally, about 2 hours now into no sleep, and at pinnacle aggravation, I went into the bathroom and ripped off some toilet paper wads to stuff in my ear canals. That'll do it, I thought as the paper cut off all exterior noise. Back to bed I went. I was under my covers for about 2 seconds when I realized how wrong I was. They didn't make a goddamn difference. The whispering was still there, and somehow at the same exact volume, almost silent, yet hearable. No quieter, no louder. I was so fed up at that point I started pounding my arms on the mattress like a child having a temper tantrum. What the hell am I gonna do, I wondered? What in God's name is that? I'd find no answers that night, though, nor would I find any sleep. Instead, I started my first day at my new job exhausted. Having to work on no sleep is one thing. Having to work on your first day, knowing nobody, while having to make an impression in every conversation and duty you perform is another. It was hell. But I somehow managed. By the end of the shift, I was so tired I figured that, whispering or not tonight, I was going to crash into a deep sleep as soon as I got into bed. Cliff was already home when I arrived, cooking us a dinner in the kitchen. He heard me enter and began to say, "How was the first day?" but didn't complete the sentence. One look at the expression on my face and he knew something was amiss. "Everything okay, Mike?" he asked as I sat on the bar stool in front of the kitchen island he was working at. I shook my head. "I'm on no sleep, bro." "Wow, no sleep. That sounds brutal. What kept you up? It wasn't me, was it?" No, I told him. "But I'm surprised you couldn't hear it." "Hear what?" "Some sort of talking. It sounded like whispering. I tried to plug my ears, but I couldn't drown it out." Cliff looked perplexed. "Whispering? Coming from where?" "Well, that's the thing," I began. "I couldn't figure it out. I walked all over my room, even upstairs, and I couldn't place it." "And it lasted all night?" I nodded my heavy head. Cliff was at a loss. "Damn, I'm sorry to hear that, man." I gave a half grin in return. "Look, I'm going to skip dinner and just run a hot bath. I'll have a bite before I head to bed tonight. I'm just going to turn in early." Sure, Cliff replied accommodatingly. "I'll wrap up a plate and put it in the fridge for you." I thanked him and went downstairs for a bath. It was so relaxing I nearly fell asleep in the tub, actually. The silence of the room was heavenly. It hit me just right, to the point that I skipped eating and just went to my bed when I was finished. I hit my pillow and began to drift right away. But it was only the drift that I'd experienced before the whispering started up. My eyes shot open. It can't be. Again, I found myself walking around the room trying to find where it was coming from, even standing on a chair to put my ear near the vent on the ceiling. No luck. So for the second night in a row, I went upstairs to see if there was a radio left on somewhere, anything. Cliff hadn't gone to bed yet. He was lying on the couch in the living room reading a book. Peering over the top of it, he reminded me that my meal was in the fridge. "Do you not hear that?" I snapped back. Taken aback, Cliff listened for a few seconds. "I don't hear anything." I noticed at that point that neither could I, and felt a little foolish. "Come downstairs," I told him. He had no objections and followed me down to the basement. We walked into my room and stopped in the center of it. "Okay, listen," I said with my index finger in the air and my ear cocked in listening position. Squinting his eyes, Cliff gave a good listen for another few seconds. "I don't hear—" "Shh," I interrupted. "Just listen." We stood there for about 30 seconds, more than long enough for me to realize there wasn't a sound to be heard. It was even quieter down here than in the living room without any appliances around to be buzzing. "I don't know what I'm supposed to be hearing, Mike," Cliff eventually said. I was so frustrated. It's like an incoherent whispering, but it stopped now. I was trying to get some sleep just now, and I heard it again. This is the first time Cliff gave me a genuine look of concern, by which I mean for my mental state. "Well," he replied, "if it's stopped now, maybe it's a good time to try to get some sleep." As frustrated as I was, I couldn't argue with that suggestion. I mean, the noise had stopped after all. "Yeah, you're right." Cliff patted me on my shoulder and wished me luck. "I'm gonna go to bed too, I think, so you won't have me making any further noise. Good night, Mike." I returned the salutation and he left. There was nothing left for me to do except turn off the light again and get back into bed. But as soon as I did, the whispering was back. I groaned in utter dismay, grabbing the sides of my pillow and covering my ears tight. But of course that didn't help. It was as if this godforsaken whispering was coming from inside my own head. But not like I was thinking it up, more like someone had put an external voice inside my skull to torture me. I spent the next while, how long I don't know, searching the whole basement, crawl space included, for the source of the sound, hearing it at a steady volume the whole time. The search turned up nothing more than frustration, and I swear the stress was making me see things. I kept thinking I saw a person moving just out of view out of the corner of my eye. The delirium of tiredness was starting to really wear on me, I figured. When I finally looked at the clock, it read 2:15. I'd been at it for hours. I couldn't believe it. With no other options, I grabbed my pillows and blanket and headed up the stairs to the living room. Whenever I went up there so far, the whispering had ceased, so I figured I'd sleep on the couch. Well, once again, I thought wrong. The whisper was just as prevalent there as in my own bed. I swear to God, I almost broke into tears. No matter how hard I tried to ignore it, it wouldn't get away from the forefront of my mind. The more I tried, the worse it got. It dominated my psyche. I was at its mercy, and it showed me none. Before I knew it, my brother was up and getting ready for work upstairs in his room. He was shocked when he came down to the main floor and saw me on the couch. "You slept up here?" he asked, somewhat stating the obvious. I was so frazzled after all those hours of mental torture, I almost couldn't speak. I didn't sleep a wink. Cliff looked at me with an expression of brotherly pity. "Oh man, Michael, I'm sorry to hear that. The noise again?" I shook my head yes. "Being up here didn't help?" I shook no. "Can you hear it now?" I listened. No, not anymore," I mumbled dismally. "Oh man," he repeated while he tightened his necktie. "I'll tell you what, I'll help you find it after work. We'll take care of it, I promise." I tried to return a smile, but I was so miserable I doubt it resembled anything like one. And with that, Cliff left for work. An hour later, I was getting into my car in the driveway. I did not feel right. This was 48 hours of absolutely zero sleep to speak of. My head was a mess, and I didn't trust my judgment. But this was a new job. I couldn't miss my second day, so I had to grin and bear it. Luckily, I survived the drive there, stopping at a drive-thru for a large coffee with extra sugar on the way. Now, I'm not a coffee drinker, but that day I knew it would be the only thing that was going to get me through it. Day 2 of no sleep is a tough one. You can feel fatigue all over your body. Your mind is slow, you're sore, your chest is weak, and your breaths are shallow. You can feel your heartbeat, and it's going at a slower pace than usual. It's a little scary. Not only that, but you haven't had a chance to really re-up your serotonin, so you're somewhat depressed too. I was all of the above, plus super anxious that my new boss would think I was either on drugs or just weird. It was hell. Yet, I made it through the day and got home after work a little shaky, but still in one piece. Cliff was already home with dinner on the table. He told me he'd searched the whole house and yard and couldn't hear anything out of the ordinary, nor find any device that might be emitting a sound like the one that I'd described. I thanked him for both and wolfed back my meal. With no sleep, food was the only thing affording me any strength at all. I got a DVD on the way home from work, he told me with a grin. Goonies. That actually lifted my spirits a little. That was our favorite movie as kids. We must have watched the VHS 1,000 times. Plus, I've always been known to pass out during nighttime movies, so throwing that on sounded like a hell of a plan. Unfortunately, though, as luck would have it, I didn't fall asleep during it. But Cliff did. He was snoring up a storm on the lazy boy beside the couch. Jesus, I was jealous. I would have traded the entire world to find some sleep like that, even just an hour's worth. I hadn't heard the noise during the film, but I was getting more and more anxious as time ticked on, knowing soon it would be me versus the night, in a battle I'd lost 2 nights in a row to my deepest chagrin. After sending a half-asleep Cliff up to his bedroom, I headed down to mine, already feeling defeated and nervous. I laid down in my bed and, well, nothing. It was silent, no whispering. Before I knew it, I was dreaming. But before you congratulate me, that dream came to an abrupt end extremely quickly. I probably slept for about 2 minutes before I was jolted awake by the whispering. It was back. Only this night, it had changed. Evolved, if you will. Now I could understand something that was being said. The word that jolted me awake was my own name. I heard, Michael, as if whispered directly in both of my ears at once, and it forced my eyes open and demolished my dreams in an instant, and I jolted awake. Aside from being startled, the disappointment I felt was unquantifiable. The discouragement was exponential. It rang continuously in my head, like a psychopath was telling me a secret I didn't want to know. Every now and then, my name found its way through the incoherent drivel. I tossed and turned, trying my best to ignore it, but despite being almost inaudible, it was intense and unceasing, like a radio dial caught between stations. You can turn the volume as low as you want, but eventually you're going to scream, "Fuck!" and turn the stereo off. This night, I'll admit, it brought me to tears. I laid and prayed several times for God to show me some mercy, to please let me sleep. But sleep never came. My alarm went off and it was time to go to work again. I didn't know if I could do it. I was off balance walking to the shower that morning. When I turned the light on, it was as if the photons were piranhas and my eyeballs were fresh mollusk. I nearly hissed at it. I was so delirious I could have sworn I saw a silhouette behind the shower curtain before I whipped it open to reveal it was empty. My faculties were definitely not about me. I ran a few red lights on the way to work and nearly got killed in the process each time, which jump-started my pulse, giving me the feeling that my heart, my tired heart was about to burst in my chest. My new coworkers looked at me like I'd turned into Frankenstein overnight. The bags under my eyes were black at this point. 72 hours with only so much as a wink, a tease, a cruel joke, and a cavalcade of torment. My boss called me into his office and asked if everything was all right. I had to fess up. My mind wasn't working well enough to come up with an excuse. I told him I hadn't slept in 3 days, that I was experiencing insomnia. He chalked it up to the shock to the system of moving from another state and starting a new job. Unlike the cursed whisper at home, he took pity on me. He sent me home and told me to get some shut-eye and show up the next day for work well-rested and ready to go. The drive home was about as risky as the one to work, but nobody got hurt, thank goodness. I got in the door and slumped on the couch like a crash test dummy, too weak to make it to my bedroom. I was ready to sleep for days, feeling now like I couldn't fight it even if I tried, but the whisper was there and ready, as if it had been waiting for me. I laid on the couch, my eyes open and twitching, my mind crossing into the recesses of insanity. The anxiety I felt now, knowing my boss was going to be looking at me and judging me the next day to see if I got sufficient sleep, and if not, would probably fire me, made the whole situation that much more horrendous. But even though my mind was wired with those thoughts, and thoughts of the life I had a week ago in San Diego, where I'd hit my bed and sleep the whole night through, and thoughts about how my brother was going to lose this place when I wouldn't be able to come up with my half of the rent due to lack of income, all of those thoughts spinning my mind in circles took a backseat to the constant whispers driving me into madness. Soon enough, my brother came down the stairs. I was surprised. "You're home?" "Yeah," he answered. "I came in a few minutes ago, and you were asleep, so I did my best to be quiet. I hope I didn't wake you." I didn't believe him. "Asleep? I haven't slept a wink in days." "Well, I walked right past you, and you looked to be snoring pretty heavily." I scanned him with suspicion. Was he right? Had I fallen asleep? Looking at the time, it was a few hours since I'd gotten home. Maybe he was right, but in my mind that was so fried from no sleep, at least adequate sleep, my suspicions didn't let me believe him. I said no more and went downstairs to my bed, but it was of no use. The whispers kept taunting me, every now and then calling me by name. Eventually I couldn't take it and went back upstairs to eat. Cliff was of course already up there. Every time we made eye contact, I could see a look of nervous concern on his face. We barely said more than a few words to each other as I fixed myself a plate of crackers and meat, too frazzled to handle cooking anything. Cliff quickly grabbed his supper and took it to the living room to eat it. In truth, my rage was beginning to fall in his direction. My head was recalling being 7 years old again, being on the bottom bunk of the bed and Cliff doing his best to scare me at night. That's what he's doing again, I thought. The fucking bastard. He's whispering into the vents and then pretending to sleep when I go check. I know it. I never hear the voices when he's around. I stared from the kitchen into the living room, where Cliff sat watching TV. Every now and then he'd look in my direction, and then back to the TV when he'd see that I wasn't taking my scowling eyes off of him. I thought of confronting him, but still had a sliver of doubt in me. So instead, when I finished eating, I went for a walk to try to clear my head. The sun was going down, and the serene atmosphere of dusk in Savannah did well to calm my state. I started to feel silly about blaming Cliff. What's more, I started to feel really tired once again, so I headed back to the house, and when I got home, I headed straight to bed. Cliff was turning in as I hit the staircase to the basement. "Good night," I heard him say as he hit the staircase in the opposite direction. Though I had started to feel somewhat silly about blaming him, I guess I still had some anger lingering in me at that point, maybe because I was now within the walls of the scene of the crime again. In any case, I didn't say goodnight back. By the time I was in bed, the whispering was back on cue, and I once again heard my name again within the static. My rage turned fully to my brother again. I stared through the darkness at the vent on my ceiling. It was him. I knew it. The fury began to boil in my exhausted body. I could feel my weakened heart beating through my whole torso. How could he do this to me? This asshole was gonna kill me with this sick prank. Didn't he know when enough was enough? Well, he'd know now. I peeled the blankets off of myself and headed to the stairs, climbing each with a solid stomp under my foot. When I got to the top of the second staircase, there he was, pretending to be asleep. I stood in his door and watched the show. It was convincing, I'll give him that. Then I looked over beside the bed. There on the floor was a vent for the central air. That was the one he was using to torture me. "Cut the shit, Clifford," I announced. He pretended to jerk his body and turned to me in feigned confusion. What are you doing, Mike?" "Enough!" I screamed, causing him to shoot up in bed. "I know it's you!" He knew exactly what I was talking about. "You're losing your mind," he snapped back. "I'm losing my mind because of you!" Ugh, I wanted to kill him. Cliff stood up to his feet and approached me. "Get the hell out of my room, Mike." We were now face to face. I'd forgotten what it was like to square off with him. He was still so much bigger than me, but I didn't back down. "It's just like when we were kids," I told him. "You're messing with me, but we're not kids anymore, Cliff. This is doing me serious harm. I could lose my job." Cliff's anger dissipated some. His concern for me returned to his expression. "Michael, look me in the eyes. It's not me." I could see he meant it. He at least sold it well. I didn't know what to believe. Exhausted, emotionally spent, and physically defeated, I broke down like a child and tears started pouring out of my eyes. Cliff sighed and then put his arms around me. "We're gonna get you some help," he told me. "Sleep in my bed tonight. I never hear anything in here. I'll hit the couch." It was quite a gesture, but it still didn't convince me. However, the voices returned as soon as I heard Cliff downstairs snoring on the couch, meaning it couldn't have been him. I would have felt guilty if I had the strength for it, but the only emotion my brain could muster at that point was panic. The whispers taunted me until the sun came up. I hadn't slept at all. Again. At this point, I had to call into work. I couldn't face the day. I was so weak that my breaths were seconds apart from each other, and as shallow now as my heartbeat. If I'd slept on the couch the day before for an hour or so, that would have given me about an hour of sleep within 96 hours. These were dire times. It was at that point I seriously considered taking my own life. I hate to say it. I'd never thought any thoughts like that before, but I knew I couldn't live like this much longer. Cliff got my dad involved at that point, and my dad scheduled me in for a visit with one of his good friends who just so happened to be a psychiatrist. With his availability for the first session I could see him in being a few days away, he wrote my father a prescription for very heavy sleeping pills, telling him that if I took one, I wasn't to work the next day. They were powerful enough to require a 24-hour recovery period. After Cliff got home from work, he drove us over to see my dad on the island. Though I was in a somewhat delirious state when I saw him, I'll always remember the look on his face when he greeted us at the door. He looked like he was looking at a car wreck with his son mangled inside of it. A pretty apt analogy for my life at that point, actually. He told me that he was just on his way out to pick up the pills when we arrived, and told us to make ourselves at home until he got back. So, we went inside and parked ourselves on the couch. The next thing I knew, I was waking up on that same couch all alone in the dark. My dad's house was silent. I let out a massive yawn and stretched myself out before standing up. Where were Cliff and my dad, I wondered as I made my way to the front window. Opening the blinds, I closed my eyes as sunlight struck my eyeballs like hot acid. It was the middle of the day, and Cliff's car wasn't in the driveway. My throat was as dry as desert sand, so I went into the kitchen for a drink of water. All the blinds were closed in there, too. I guess my father heard me turn the sink on because he came in through the other kitchen door. "Ah, good morning," he said with a smile. "Boy, do you look better than yesterday." "Yesterday?" I questioned. "Yes, sir. You've been asleep for 17 hours. I looked at the clock and it was 11:39. In a panic, I told him I was late for work and asked why he hadn't woke me up. "Well," my dad said, "you looked half dead. I figured you needed the sleep." He was right about that. I felt better than I had in what seemed like forever. My mind was groggy, but not frazzled. My body was tired, but not fatigued to the point of exhaustion. I was revitalized. But there was no time to focus on any of that. I had to be somewhere. My dad was nice enough to drive me to work, which took over an hour from his place. When I finally got there, I was pulled into my boss's office right away, and my worst fear came true. They fired me. I don't blame them in hindsight. They took a chance on hiring a guy from out of town, and he quickly looked like a train wreck. A few days later, he called in, and the next day, he showed up at 12:30 in the day with no call beforehand. At the time, though, I was devastated. This insanity was starting to ruin me. Again, I thought of the S word. But thank God for good family. My father was blessed with success in his career and offered to help me out with the rent and bills until I found myself a new job. His only terms were that I handle the problem that I was having at night first. Getting back to mine and Cliff's new house that day was like returning back to an abusive relationship. I already hated this place. But, I thought optimistically, I slept the night before. Maybe this pattern had been broken. Maybe the whispering I had been hearing was all in my head. A symptom of stress from a new job, a new beginning and all that, just like my boss had said. My former boss, that is. Maybe. Just maybe. When nighttime came, the anxiety was beginning to build up inside of me, but I told myself there was no pressure. Cliff seconded that notion, saying that I didn't have to worry about waking up for work the next day, that I had just caught up on the sleep my body and mind desperately needed, that I'd eaten properly that day, and if I couldn't fall asleep, I had medication to assist me. Those sentiments actually really did help, and though I still had some anxiety lurking about in the background, I went to bed with more confidence than any other night that I had prior in that house, other than that first night. As I hit my pillow, all I could hear was the humming of a quiet house. I sighed a breath of relief. But then it happened. The whispering returned. And it never just came abruptly either. It always crept into the room. This time it began with my name, Michael, and then the static of inaudible chatter. The anger and fear that always fizzled up in me so quickly at that sound was right on cue, but I stopped myself from freaking out by remembering the sleeping pills my father had acquired. I went up to the kitchen and popped one with a small glass of water, knowing damn well I didn't want to have to wake up to go to the washroom in the middle of the night. My instructions were to be in bed directly after, as they were fast-acting. Back in bed, the whispers continued, but this time they were contending with the drugs, which were certainly quick to function. I could feel myself slow down into kind of a hypnotic state. I was almost paralyzed, but they didn't knock me out. Instead, I laid there and began to see the most terrifying images I could imagine. Meanwhile, the whispers got louder and louder, and pretty soon I could understand exactly what was being said, and it wasn't comforting to say the least. What's worse, I could see the sources of the voices now. There were what I can only describe as demonic entities, 6 of them surrounding my bed and glaring down at me. I would have guessed they had been human at one time, but now existed only in dark spirit. They wore expressions of fierce, threatening anger. They kept telling me I was intruding, that I didn't belong there, that me and my brother were trespassers and that we must leave or suffer the worst consequences. One of them leaned in so close that I could smell his presence and said in a low grumble of a voice, "Leave us or join us." I was immobilized with fear. Had I not been on the pill and seen this, I still don't think I would have had the wherewithal to make a run for it. Those faces, my dear God, they were horrifying. And they didn't just stand in place. They would lean forward and get right up in my face, causing my heart to pound harder in my chest than I knew was possible. I was convinced I was having a heart attack. After I don't know how long of this torment, I somehow conjured up the strength to scream as loud as I'd ever screamed in my life. At this, they laughed, and then faded into nothingness as my brother's footsteps made their way down to the basement. Bursting in the door, he flipped on the light and asked what was wrong. I was so doped up I could only slur my words. I tried to describe what I'd seen, but it was of no use. Cliff was freaking out, clearly thinking I was having a stroke or something. Finally, he figured out that I was under the influence of the sleeping pills and relaxed a little. But by then, I'd passed into a deep sleep, unable to fight the drugs any longer. When I got up the next morning, I went to the kitchen for a glass of water, and being the weekend now, Cliff was up there. I then had the chance to describe what happened without slurring my words, what I'd seen, what I'd heard. He told me he'd looked into the pills that I'd took and explained that they had some pretty wild side effects, hallucinations being one of the main culprits. I suppose that could have been the case, I told him, but it all seemed so real. Well, it wasn't, Cliff insisted. If you take these pills and don't fall asleep, they induce a dreamlike state while you're still awake, and that's what happened. If it happens more than a couple times, you're supposed to stop taking them. I nodded my head as if I'd understood. Going back down to the basement, I grabbed a towel and headed into the bathroom. Before I showered, though, I grabbed my toothbrush as usual and looked down to turn the water on in the sink. Looking back up, I jumped back and turned a 180 on a dime. Though I saw nothing there, I swore I'd seen a person hanging from a belt and swinging directly behind me. My heart once again was at full pace. I looked up to where the belt would have been tied to. There was a big black pipe going into the ceiling, and I thought I noticed something scratched into the wall beside it. What the hell? I said to myself as I climbed up onto the seat of the toilet to get a better look. I was right. There were words there, all right, and a date. It said, "There is only one way to make the voices stop. JVC 5/16/87. My heart sank. I didn't even think to turn the sink off. I just ran out of the room and burned it upstairs. Moments later, Cliff and me were both standing in my bedroom. He couldn't believe what he was seeing either as he read it out loud to himself while he stood on the toilet. I think at first he thought I'd carved it. I mean, he thought I was nuts already, so I can't blame him. But it was clearly worn out from time. I couldn't have faked that. Holy shit, he said. Who the hell is JVC? I don't know, I answered. But he was hearing the same thing as me. I then told him about what I'd seen in the mirror. He turned white as a ghost. He definitely didn't want to believe that one. The pills, he said defiantly. They must still be in your system, Mike. You didn't see... I saw it, Cliff, I interrupted. I saw it. We both stood there in silence for a sec, both of us processing everything. Come on, he said. We're going for a ride. At first I thought he was going to commit me, but instead we went to the Georgia Historical Society, where we were allowed to look at the records pertaining to our address. Our jaws hit the floor as we read article after article of suicides in that house as we went back in time. There were 4 in total. JVC in 1987 was a man named Jonathan Victor Cayford. He had been slowly showing signs of going crazy before they found him hanging in the basement, exactly where I'd seen him in the mirror. Others had similar stories, though only a couple hanged themselves. One other shot himself in the temple, while the last one slit his own throat. Each had been hearing voices, some mostly inaudible, others hearing threats and commands, and each one swearing they were told to leave or join them, just like I'd been told. We were flabbergasted. On the one hand, I felt vindicated. On the other, I was terrified to step back into that house. The last article we read pertaining to our new house was from the mid-1800s. The house was the subject of a report on a local cult that had been practicing various conjuring methods in the basement while the house was abandoned for a short period. Hoodoo and voodoo talismans, as well as Christian and pagan artifacts, were found scattered about the house after 2 charred bodies of men were found down there after a fire. Nobody was ever caught for the crimes, and the owners rebuilt the portions of the house that burned. That family had rented out the house ever since, refusing to ever move back in. It was the same family we'd rented it from. No wonder the rent's so low, one of us said as we read all these pieces of history in complete amazement. We left the Historical Society in a state of shock. I wasn't crazy after all, but I was certainly being driven there. Now, me and Cliff weren't raised in a spiritual family, but Cliff had heard of something called smudging before, and explained to me that this is where a spiritualist of some sort comes into a place to cleanse it of the pollution of negative spirits. 2 weeks prior, I would have called the practice mumbo-jumbo, but that day, it seemed like our only hope. Looking in the yellow pages, we came across a service called the Georgian Shamanistic Society, which had smudging listed as one of its services, and we gave them a call. Cliff nervously explained the situation, probably expecting ridicule, but instead got a serious concern back from the woman he spoke to. She told us she would perform the service for us right away, and showed up at our door with a man by that evening. They were both quite old. She was a plump woman, and what wasn't gray on her head was a faded red frizzy mess of hair. The man was native, I would guess, but I could be wrong. For his age, he looked to be in incredible shape. His hair was long and parted down the middle. All of it had succumbed to the effects of graying as well. They were extremely polite and had an air of spiritual confidence to them. It's the only way I can explain it. You could just sense it, and it made us, 2 youngish grown men, oddly feel safe. I didn't know what to expect of what was to come after our introductions, but what happened, I never could have imagined. They started by asking us to turn off all the lights in the house, and then lit candles to carry around with them, explaining that when they crossed spirits of any kind, the flames would rise. They also lit fat sticks of sage to carry in their other hand, and waved it around as they spoke incantations in a language I'd never heard, softly and calmly. Cliff and I followed behind them. I was fricking terrified from the outset. I could tell Cliff was no different. They started upstairs and nothing happened for a while. By the time they were in the living room, they stopped at one point and we watched as the flames on their candles rose high. Here they said a few stronger verses and waved the sage back and forth until the flames went back to normal. This happened a few times on the main floor. But things got dramatically different by the time we got to the bottom of the stairs to the basement. The flames of the candles rose to heights I wouldn't believe candles could achieve. They both stopped suddenly inside the door of my room, as if picking up on electricity that could harm them if they went any further. They waved the sage around and said their incantations louder and with more purpose than ever before. We stood in silence, observing from behind them. Then all of a sudden, their candles went like blowtorches before being completely extinguished. All that could be seen now was the red glowing cherries of their sage sticks. Fear gripped me and Cliff all the same. I could tell because we naturally got really close beside each other. Suddenly it was like we were two children again. Every muscle in our bodies flexed in trepidation. At that point, the whispering started up, more venomous and angry than I'd ever heard it before. "Oh my God," Cliff whispered over them. "I can hear it." I was too scared to respond verbally. I just nodded at him. The two shamans waved their sage sticks back and forth while reciting their verses louder. Suddenly the sage in the man's hand shot forth burning embers from its tip all over the place, as if it had been blown by an airplane. We were freaking out, but he and his partner kept their cool, keeping the incantations going and waving the sage to and fro. They relit their candles, but the flames once again rose to astonishing heights before being violently blown out again. It didn't trip them up one bit, though. They just slowly persisted on through the dark of the basement, performing their ritual. Soon the whispers were accompanied by growls. The window panes began to shake vigorously. I was sure they would smash to pieces soon. I suddenly found myself digging my fingers into Cliff's upper arm, while he dug his into my forearms. The shamans kept their cool and never broke stride, though. The whispers and growls intensified, the windows shook, and the floor and frame of the entire house began creaking like I'd never heard. There wasn't any doubt in my mind that this whole thing was about to collapse in and bury us. The shamans showed no fear, raising their voices and looking around while they waved the sage, their embers flying all over as if caught in a windstorm. By the time they'd reached the bathroom, us right behind them, the mirror exploded into a million smithereens. We jumped. They didn't. Still, our guests didn't show the slightest bit of fear. Tracking back, they stopped at my bed and hollered their chants over the noise of the house and growls, which together were near deafening at that point. A harsh wind was streaming through the basement that nearly bowled us over. This was it, I thought. We're all gonna die here. And then... silence. Nobody said a word. The woman pulled out a match and lit the candles. We followed them around the house a few more times. The flames didn't rise an inch. "Okay," the man finally said as he turned back to us in the living room. "You can turn the lights on now. They are gone." I did as he said, finally letting go of my brother's arm. Sure, I'd left handprints in it. We all stood there looking around. You're sure?" I asked. "Yes," the woman said with a wise grin. "They can't hide. They have left here and are not allowed to return." We were blown away. It was worth the $200 they charged. Though when they left, it was impossible for both of us to get to sleep that night. No, there were no voices to be heard, but the experience had shaken us to the core. Luckily, they were right, though. I never heard another voice in that house. I never saw another scary thing that I could think of, except for a disaster of a girl that Cliff began to date a little while later that year, but that's a different story. In the end, I found another job and I still work there today. I no longer live in that house, though, but Cliff and his family do. That rent was too good to give up. And truth be told, they love that house. I've never experienced insomnia since then. God willing, I hope I never do. Like I said in the beginning, that was the wildest week of my life. Thank God I got through it. Well, that's the end of this broadcast, my friends. I'm glad to see you've stuck around until the end. I hope you've enjoyed it. If so, give it a thumbs up and a share to help us out in the algorithm, and maybe we can reach some new ears. If you haven't yet, take a second to hit that subscribe button. You won't regret it. We have many more stories on the way and many available on our channel for you to hear right now if you'd like to keep the vibe going. As always, this episode has been brought to you by cardanapparel.com, and the link is in the description for you. I can't wait to see you again in the next broadcast from the Nocturnity Zone, my friends. Until then, sleep well.